did not have a lot of, we didn't, newspapers were discouraged. That was in the tradition, especially at that time. But even in more recent years, we would get news from people of what was going on through family members or through the chaplains or things like that. So we knew more or less what was going on. But to do a very close following of things was not our tradition. I think anybody can understand it just by not having the media. I mean, it's hard to imagine that now. I mean, not having the television and the radio, going all the time. Whether it's by your own choice or because you're in the car or it's going all over. That in probably the past 15 years, that's been people have had to explore that a little bit more. Partly because they've been going out to the doctor more of the time, so they're getting it on the outside, more of the outside contact anyway. But really probably until almost 2000, it was very filtered. Information coming in, and politics were not really the kind of conversation. We would get news, prayer requests, and that would come in, news especially about families, where they so good news, bad news, that. But also, we took time to talk about what was blooming in the garden, it was just a sharing of stories. In a very beautiful way. At the time that I entered in 1990, we actually had 4 generations living in the house. And one of the last of our foundresses was still living. So we got not only community history, but we got kind of histories in some places we knew about, some ways for some families we kind of knew more about their great aunt than they did. And it was just a gentle time of sharing, and the goal of it was a time of relaxation. That would allow the sisters to go back to prayer, allow them to sustain in some ways the solitude in a better way. So sometimes, but also there's something about living, about recreating together. Sometimes they would walk in the garden together. That time for St. Teresa was important as far as the bonding goes. The helping to, sharing concerns, family members sick, that everybody, you get news on it. You kind of share in that prayer as well as getting news, of graduations or births or but we also heard about the news of the local church as well as news. The record, of course, didn't make it in, at least in more reasons. But
when you think about politics, it's important, of course, and it could be annoying. It could also be depressing.
It's one thing. Until probably about 2000, the nuns did not vote. After that time, they were free to do that. But one of the questions, obviously, of responsibility is that if you're going to vote, then you are going to have to be more informed.
Sure.
So people, each one could make that decision.
What about, you mentioned like longevity, what about diet?
We don't, according to our rule of life, unless there's a need, for instance, for health reasons, to eat meat, then we didn't. And so ordinarily it wasn't available. Occasionally, if we had somebody in the infirmary that needed it, then they would make some arrangement for it. But other than that, it was a lot depended on what was given, what was donated. That was an important part of supporting our life. In fact, going back to the early days of the Depression, one of the families there that came for prayers for it was a man who came for prayers for his business. We were very grateful and continued to donate vegetables to us, even until we moved. So I mean, those a lot what was given to us, we would make use of those things. So in a very, that's a way that we kind of have stayed close to kind of the domestic side of family. So a lot of what we were getting, for instance, people coming to the turn asking for prayers, was a very family kind of, somebody stops at the grocery and comes by Carmel after they've stopped at the grocery, drops off a few cans of soup, and leaves their prayer intention for and talks about what's going on in their family right at that time.
Now we're in the Sisters Choir, and I think that Sister John Baptist would have some very good things to tell us about this remarkable space.
The nuns' choir is on the opposite side of the chapel. After Vatican II, the solid wall divided the two sides was opened with grates so that we were able to see the altar, see the priest at the altar during the Mass. And also the side grates opened things so that we were better able to hear the readings, which of course now are in the vernacular, now in English. For most of the day, which was a continuation, really, in a certain sense, was taken as a continuation of the Eucharistic liturgy. Kind of the Eucharist being the heart of the day and of our lives, was spent the chanting of the Divine Office, the liturgy of the hours in the monastic tradition here in the choir. The Taunton Monastery was built. It was built to hold what was at that time the maximum for Carmel, for the discussed Carmelite nuns, which was 22. That included the priors and the sub-priors, who were the two who governed the community. They were democratically elected by the chapter, which is the gathering of the nuns. But the nuns would divide into whereas for the most part we did things antiphonally, one side and then another would respond. So it was as though we were speaking the psalms to each other during as well as praying together during that time. With Carmel, the balancing of the time of solitary work, the coming together of the community didn't just divide the day, but they kind of unified the day. As I mentioned, we began in the morning here, first thing. We would have a silence from after the night office until the following morning. Then the nuns would come. The first thing that we would do, so first the chanting, we would have the ringing of the Angelus. The bell tower, we have two bells up there. The bell tower would announce the beginning of the day and call the nuns to prayer. We would begin with the Angelus, or the Regina Coeli, the Easter season. And that would be the first really that we were speaking, and we would be just praying together those prayers. And then we would go right into the liturgical office of morning prayer, lauds. As we would chant, that's primarily a chanting of psalms. Our tradition is very simple, and we maintain that one, except for feast days, that it would just be a simple recto tono, really a monotone chant. But it was accompanied by ceremonies which are typical of the monastic order. The tacks on the floor were places that identified where the nuns would go to stand. So on each side they would come together, and someone would be designated to chant a certain part, an introduction. There would be one sister who would be appointed for the week to lead the prayers. So that all kinds of little weekly routines where you would be designated. It tied obedience was a part of our life, just even in the ordinary things. Being designated to do something for a certain week, you would wash the dishes or anything. But it was tied together so that you had your religious duty, or your ceremonial duty, as well as your little household duty for the week. But here in the choir, because it was so focused, we had the Blessed Sacrament reserved. The tabernacle used to be at this side after the renovation. Formerly it was in the center. That it was a place of prayer. Sometimes the nuns would take a little bit of time during the day when they had to do some short time. They'd come and make a visit to the Blessed Sacrament, maybe pray the Rosary at that time. But the main thing that this choir was used for was the chanting of the liturgy, That's prayer of the church, and the responsibility of the nuns that in a special place, if you want to talk about our role in the church as a role of prayer, that kind of represented what that was. So that every day, throughout the day, there was someone, we just kept coming on behalf of the church, coming together for those prayers, for the time of prayer. But really, it's God's gift to us, the Psalms. So it's chanting what God already has given us. There were ceremonies involved with it that added beauty to it, but also kind of coordination and kind of a focus held the kind of attentiveness but really fostered a sense of participating and even of worshiping with your whole body. The genuflections, the bows, the standing and the sitting, the moving from one part of the space to another. another. There was kind of a gracefulness about it. There was not choreography, but some an orderliness.
And when the sister died, she would be waiting in this space?
This really was our worship space. So the sisters, having lived in an enclosure, would also be buried from our chapel, from our side.
Any particular rituals associated with those, the wake or the funerals?
As much as possible, we would stay. Actually, the last sister, we had two, in the time that I've been here, we had two sisters who actually died here at maybe three, who died here at the monastery, not in a hospital or university school. And ordinarily the sisters lived their whole life here, and it's by way of exception, especially in more recent years when the opportunities that a nursing facility provides, as well as the limits to our capacity to provide that care, that we've made use of that. But ordinarily, people lived here their whole life, and then even the early, when it first came, we still were able to keep the sister here even in preparation for that, preparation for the burial, rather. And sisters would, someone would come in to assist us a bit with that, but then the sisters would stay, keep vigil with the body of prayer for vigil. We would continue our prayers in the choir at the ordinary time, but it was just kind of surrounding the sister with prayer. Then at certain times the grate was open for people to come, at least the curtain was open for people to come for a visitation. And then we would have the funeral mass. The mass itself would take place on the outside, but then at the end the priest would come in, and the priest and his attendants would come in, and we would proceed to the cemetery at the back. We were very fortunate that the original property came from Calvary Cemetery, which allowed us to bury within the enclosure. Not every farm has that opportunity. And that's been a blessing for us also, because just in prayer for the dead, that sense of the communion of saints, the living and the deceased, we have a strong sense of that in this life. Not only because we are especially blessed to pray for the dead, that's built into the liturgy, that we have so many friends who've gone before us and our own sisters, but that sense of a communion of the church, that's not just it's throughout the world, but as they say, diachronic, that it goes through time, a sense of community there, but a sense of praying for the dead, but also a sense of the intercession that they provide. And in the old days, the daily chanting, the sisters would move from one part of the monastery to another as a community and in procession. They would have specifically some of the prayers, like the De Profundis, that were specifically prayers for the dead, offered for the dead. In the ancient monastic custom actually had to do with the fact that oftentimes the crypt was below those cloisters, which wasn't the case here. But that sense of praying for of a continuum of life after death is very much at the heart of the Christian tradition, the Christian faith. But it's really a lived part. I mean, we have sisters who would pray to somebody to thread the needle. It was just an ordinary part of our life, but also in a very beautiful way. Oftentimes we would, different ones of us would incorporate just in walking out in the garden, maybe just kind of a little prayer walk where we would go down to the end of the garden where the cemetery is and just stop for a time of prayer. It's, again, has been a beautiful way of maintaining not only our prayer for those who have died, more recently, as well as the sisters early on, and our own sisters, as well as our all who departed. But in a beautiful way, in that sense also that they pray for us, that we have intercessors, and as a community, it's been something that has helped us to maintain our sense of the broad sense of community, the sense of tradition, the sense of mutual support. In religious life, that as much as it's an individual consecration to God that one has to willingly choose, it's also a communal vocation. It's a gift to the church. It's lived in the church, and especially in religious life, it's supported by an ecclesial community. we certainly have that sense of support in the Archdiocese, but here, within in the closeness of the religious community, we have to be there for each other, even though it wasn't a lot of verbal exchange for us, not a lot of one-on-one conversations, just that mutual sense of supporting each other in their efforts to grow in holiness, to be faithful to God, to be faithful to growing in prayer, to the acts of charity, because we lived so closely together and spent so much time together side by side. We would be here for the chanted prayers, but we would also be here for Mass, but we would also be here for the silent prayer, which is unique to each one. But we were gathered for it. So there was that sense of solidarity that has supported us and continues to support us even in the diaspora as we now are.
Very kind of let me ask you all these questions, and we're very grateful. Is there anything that I've done that makes sense to ask that you would like to talk about before we conclude today?
Our place in the church, we've touched on it with the ties with the Archdiocese, but friends that have supported us in all kinds of ways. I've mentioned religious, but the lay people who have been friends over the years, whether it's coming for prayer or just helping take sisters to the doctor. I didn't really talk about what led us to leave, and that's kind of a long story, and in some ways it's a very short story. It doesn't happen very quickly. But the change in demographics of the community, with that interplay between tradition and the needs of a modern age, the demands, as it were, of a modern age. Those things pressed on Carmel in a way that, and throughout the country, that have, partly in a very good way, have provided opportunities, health opportunities for sisters to go out to the doctor more, as they can do more for you. You can do therapy. There are a lot of things that can be provided that the house calls of the old doctors couldn't provide. And we've been able to avail of that, and we have sisters who live long lives and continue activity longer than what typically was the case. The change in vocations, where that really did drop off in the 60s for sure, but really in this Carmel, it dropped because we had met our number, and we really didn't have anyone coming in the 70s or 80s. I think the very end of the 80s we were the first ones starting to come back. Then we've had people in and out in the novitiate for different levels of formation that has kept people coming in and allowed us to keep the community going longer. But as far as definitive vocations, that has not really, that's been the numbers have been very small. And at a certain point, it's this big, beautiful monastery. There were 14 nuns when they moved here from Park Avenue, but we were down to just 6 people living in the monastery at the time we left. And so to maintain the form of life, we had to choose what was central. And as much as community is an important part of our life,